market has been approaching these transformational initiatives with, two different approaches. One is where, the system integrators are bundling all of the solutions together. So they're offering the, SAP application as part of a subscription model, again, under the service provider. They're offering the implementation services, they're offering the hosting services, and they're also offering the post-production support services as well. So you can get everything cradle to grave from a single solution provider that can bring all this to bear in the market. The other approach that we're seeing is more the vendors push the responsibility back to the client, where the client is, in essence, contractor for getting all these contracts sourced, getting all of them negotiated, getting them all contracted, and then ultimately managing and aligning all of the responsibilities across all those different vendor profiles to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. So that latter approach is the one that we're going to be talking about today in our webinar, because it tends to be one of the ones that most of the customer base out there is aligning to today.
But I'm going to break it down into these three sections. First is to describe the problem itself. And what I mean by the problem is we'll go through the various risk points associated with the multi-vendor model so that you know when you implement your processes, the areas that you're going to have to try to mitigate the risks on. The second part of the presentation, then, we'll discuss 5 levers, meaning 5 what are big, I'll call it, internal processes that you can execute in order to be able to mitigate those risks. And in the final section of the material today, we'll be focused on really how you can enable those levers as you go through your sourcing process. The last thing that I've added onto this slide on the right-hand side is, as you're thinking about this from a risk management point of view, those 12 risks could go into your risk profile. On the right-hand side of the slide, what you see here is the area of the program, or the area that it most likely would affect from a risk standpoint. Will it affect cost? Will it delay the program? Will it affect quality? Or may it, in fact, actually generate a lawsuit as a result of that particular risk? So let me go into the next section now, and let's talk about what are the main levers that you can pull as an organization in order to be able to mitigate these risks. I'm going to break these levers down into 5 broad areas, and I'm going to cover these areas at a summary level first, and then we'll end this section with a decomposition of the various levers and what you should be considering as you execute your program. Now, what I've done with this slide right here is I've taken all the things that I've covered in the previous 5 slides and put them into a single, let's call it, lever decomposition that illustrates on the first, the top line, the various big levers that I talked about, the sub-levers below that, and then the various things underneath each one of those sub-levers that you should be considering as you're managing your program. And I would encourage you to take this slide on any big program that you're managing, go through those various bullets, and take inventory to say, do we have the processes in place in order to be able to mitigate the risks that we have moving forward? And then the last section I want to talk about today is, how do you actually enable this pulling of the levers in a risk mitigating form on these various problems? When you get down into the actual final negotiations in the contracts, you're being very clear on the vendor dependencies. You're being very clear on change control, very clear on how you're going to collaborate in actual contracts, and then how you're going to treat the risks, meaning what are going to be the penalties that various vendors might be, how are you going to generate your incentives, and then actually memorializing those within the contract itself. And I'm certainly not going to try to go through and drain this particular slide, but you can see on the slide here where we've got SAP and an SI, and we've got Workday, and the various steps that we were taking as we went down through each one of those areas of the RFP response. So it looks really complicated on this diagram. It actually gets a little bit more complicated when you bring all of the vendors into the pool when you're thinking about your hosting providers and such. But it is really important to be able to think about this from the beginning to the end and plan your sourcing strategy to have an effective model as you go through this process.
Thank you, John, for the very insightful information, and Dave for the wrap-up. We did questions during the presentation that we'll be answering in just a moment. First, I just wanted to note that our contact information is up on the screen here, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions or comments.